Our next speaker is truly an international man. He was born in New York City, the son of a Chilean diplomat and United Nations official. He studied French languages and civilization at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1970. Journalism at the University of Chile in Santiago in 1972 to 73. The communications theory at the Catholic University in Santiago in 74. He is fluent in Spanish, French, and English. Antonio Huneeus is a Chilean-American science journalist and researcher of extraterrestrial-related phenomena. His science journalism emphasized space-related issues and the environment. He was science editor for the weekly magazine Que Pasa in Santiago, Chile in the 1970s and wrote a weekly science column in the 1980s for the New York City Tribune and the Hispanic New York daily Noticias del Mundo. When Lawrence Rockefeller commissioned Marie Galbraith and Sandra Wright to assemble the best evidence for UFOs to send to members of Congress and VIPs worldwide in the mid-90s, Huneeus was one of the co-authors with Don Berliner and Ms. Galbraith, and this report was published under the title of UFO Briefing Document, The Best Available Evidence.
Antonio's work as journalist, investigator, and lecturer now spans 30 years. His articles have appeared in a variety of newspapers, magazines, and journals in the Americas, Europe, and Japan. He edited the Anthology, a study guide to UFOs, psychic and paranormal phenomena in the USSR. He was also consultant and producer for a laser-active disc in Japan entitled UFO and ET. He was author of the 1998 and 1999 UFO Calendar, one of several essayists in the Book of Heaven and Earth, edited by Zechariah Sitchin, and commentator for the DVD Ultimate UFO, The Complete Evidence. He's lectured at dozens of conferences in the Americas, Europe, and Asia, and he's received the Ufologist of the Year Award at the National UFO Conference in Miami Beach in 1990, the 1991 Annual Award of the New York Fortean Society, and the Coleman S. von Kavitsky Medal, international category, which was awarded by UFO Magazine in Budapest, Hungary in 2000. He served for many years as international coordinator for the Mutual UFO Network. Please welcome Antonio Huneeus to X Conference 2007.
Okay, so it's a pleasure to be back in a UFO event. Maybe some of you have seen my presentations in the past, but I haven't sort of taken a sabbatical in the last 3-4 years, so I haven't been too active. But I guess I'm back, and the sabbatical is finished. So how many of you have seen my presentations, just for curiosity? Okay? Not too many. Good. So basically, we're going to be discussing some international aspects, more in the political area, which is the contents of this conference, and particularly as it relates to the United Nations. United Nations, of course, is a subject I know pretty well for personal reasons. Like Steve read in my biography, my dad worked at the beginning of the UN in the 1940s. And then my brother was also worked at the UN, but with the Chilean delegation in the 60s. And then my sister worked at the UN at the secretariat, at the General Secretary's office for many years until she retired a couple of years ago. So I have been there many times. And I have followed the UFO initiatives, such as they were, that have taken place there. So we do have a lot of material on the PowerPoint, which I will try to cover as much as I have time. And I do have some video clips too, if we have time. I mean, at least show you some, which are some interesting statements by Russian cosmonauts. And if we have extra time, which I'm not sure, we'll get into some material about UFOs in Chile. So with that short introduction, let's get into the slides. I think, yeah. So basically, like I said, we'll be discussing the history of the UN UFO Initiative And, well, the history, then as we continue with the presentation, also what can be done in the future. Because sooner or later, the United Nations has to be the right venue for this subject, since it's the only body that really represents the whole Earth. And then we'll cover briefly some of the official efforts, France, Italy, Chile, and other countries. No, the other way. Okay. Even though I will be covering modern aspects of the UFO phenomenon, I wanted to just show one slide to show that the subject is really not new. Has been around perhaps for thousands of years. And in one project I worked in the last few years was to document a lot of the historical paintings and manuscripts, medieval illuminations, and so on, that depicted UFO-like imagery. And so here you have one sample, a painting by a Flemish painter called Gelder from around 1711 or 1713, called The Baptism of Christ. And you can really clearly see the disc-like object. UFOs, regardless of what interpretations people give them, there's one thing that can be said for sure, and that is that they're a global phenomenon. They're experienced all over the world, regardless of the political systems, the cultural attitudes, the governmental attitudes, the media, etc. They are seen everywhere in the world. We'll see just a couple of examples to make this point. Beautiful picture from Lake Nahuelhuapi in Argentina. And this is another photograph taken in Austria in the 1970s. Classical flying disc shape. And China, a famous photo, very old one, taken in the period of World War II, in the upper part, and an artist's rendition of a sighting also in China in 1974. So it's, like I said, experienced everywhere in the world. Well, so we'll start briefly with the history of the UN initiative. And basically, the UN initiative was due to one country. Before we get into that, let's, if you consult the Encyclopedia of the United Nations and international agreements from 1985, you will see a definition of the term UFO. It's right there. Unidentified flying object, an international term introduced in the 1960s for so-called flying saucers. The UN General Assembly on December 13, 1977, reached the consensus that a Grenada item, establishment of a UN agency for undertaking, coordinating, and disseminating the results of research into unidentified flying objects and related phenomena, be transmitted to the UN member states and to the specified agencies so that they might communicate their views to the Secretary General. So that is the official definition of UFO by the United Nations, because this is an official document, this encyclopedia. Okay, basically, like I was saying, the initiative of the United Nations was due to one country, the small island of Grenada, which is in the Caribbean. It used to be a British colony, very small, both in size and population. I think it has something like 100,000 people altogether. Most of you may remember, and that's probably when most of the American public became aware even of the existence of Grenada, is when President Reagan ordered the invasion of this country. That was in 1983. But in the 1970s, it had become independent and from Britain, as I said. And the first prime minister was this man, Sir Eric Gairy. He passed away, I believe, in 1999. He was probably ahead of his time because he was truly convinced of the importance of the UFO subject. And he was determined to do something about it. He began his efforts by bringing the subject to the Organization of American States, the OAS. That was around 1975. The Latin American countries, which at that time they were mostly military dictatorships, and they were all involved in the struggle against communism and so on, basically didn't give him the time of the day. That motion went nowhere. So then he decided to take it to the United Nations. And eventually he got it going there for the simple reason that Grenada was a full member state and he was a head of state. As you know, in September you have the General Assembly, and all the heads of states have a tribune to speak, whether you're a big power, small power, doesn't matter. In the Security Council it's different. You have the permanent members and a restricted number of countries. But in the General Assembly, everybody is represented, and any head of states can talk about whatever he pleases. So Gary decided to bring the UFO subject. Previously, he had consulted with a number of experts on the matter, including Dr. Hynek, the late J. Allen Hynek, and Jacques Vallée, Gordon Cooper, whom you see right there on one of the corners, and also Coleman von Kavinsky was also involved in this initiative. He was a very colorful character, a Hungarian colonel. He was one of my mentors, and that's how another reason I became very familiar with this whole initiative. This was a meeting that took place before the hearing, the public hearing at the UN, and it was at the Secretary General's office. At the time was Austrian politician Kurt Waldheim. He was the Secretary General during this period. And it's the only time this happened, where Secretary General of the UN had a meeting with a number of top UFO experts. And again, the reason why, because it was that they were the guests of a head of state. So the head of state could bring these people. Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, Mercury 7 astronaut, was very involved also in this, and his prestige helped this motion. There's a very famous letter from Gordon Cooper, which probably most of you have seen. You can find the text of it on the internet, has been quoted in many books, Timothy Good's, Clear Intent, etc. It's quoted always, everywhere. And of course, he was already retired from NASA. He was a vice president of development at Walt Disney Enterprises at the time. He's completely convinced of the existence of UFOs. He had a couple of sightings. He had one sighting himself when he was an Air Force pilot in Germany. And then when he was a colonel at Edwards Air Force Base, he was involved in another incident, although he didn't see it with his own eyes. This was an incident where a disc landed on an area there, and they had movie cameras because they were going to film some test pilots testing some military vehicles. So they had the cameras ready with tripods and everything. And Gordon Cooper got to see the footage. Then he was sent to the Pentagon and disappeared. Well, anyway, on his book, Leap of Faith, he reveals all these stories and many more. He devotes a total of 7 chapters to UFOs in that book. 7 chapters. So it's a fascinating book. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommended it. And he goes again into great detail about his involvement with the UN initiative. Well, then finally, in October, late October, I believe it was, of 1978, there was a hearing, a UFO hearing, at a meeting of the Special Political Committee. And this was the only truly official UFO event at the United Nations, because there were many speakers, myself included, who gave talks at the UN. Richard Hoagland, Linda Moulton Howe, Colin Andrews, and so on. And you might have heard about some of these presentations, but these presentations were not official. These presentations were done for the UN Recreational Staff Council. In other words, for the staff. The staff, like any large organizations, they have a number of clubs or study groups, and there was one particular one called SEAT, who was very pro-UFO. And that's the one that sponsored a lot of these talks at the UN. But they were not official events. They were held at the UN because they were meant for the employees. Of course, they were great in the sense that once they were held inside the building, anybody could attend, an ambassador, any high official, but they didn't have an official status. This one did. And I was lucky. I was just getting started. I had arrived in New York City only barely a year. I was in my very, very early stages. My background, as they read in my biography, was science journalism. And I had covered some paranormal issues and the environment and so on. But I really wasn't into UFOs until I got started with the Corporal Valdez case, which was a very strange case that took place in the Chilean desert in 1977 involving an army patrol. And that was the first case that I published and wrote about it. And so I was totally green. I was just getting started. And a friend of mine happens to point it out that there is a UFO hearing at the United Nations. And I was living in Manhattan at the time, so it was perfect. At that time, security and all those things were very easy. You could get into the UN building with no problem. Besides, I had press cards from various Chilean publications. So there I was. I made it to this meeting. I heard the presentations by, of course, the Prime Minister, by Dr. Hynek, by Jacques Vallée. There was also Lieutenant Colonel Coyne of the famous Coyne helicopter incident. He was the only witness that spoke. And as he made clear, he was there on his personal, not representing the U.S. Army. And then the Gordon Cooper letter. Gordon Cooper was not present at that particular hearing, but his letter was read into the record. And then there was a press conference, was packed, and then a reception. So it was quite a start for a ufological career to have started with that one. So anyway, this whole initiative eventually led to this document. It's called a decision. Decision is very different from a resolution. A UN resolution, as some of you may recall, when, about the Iraq weapons of mass destruction and things like that, those have legal power, and they're voted. And if a resolution is passed, then it can be enforced. A decision is something that is kind of automatically tabled, and it doesn't have that same kind of power, but it is still a legal document, and it still provides a framework. And this is basically what was the Grenada proposal, the establishment of an agency or department of the United Nations for undertaking, coordinating, and disseminating the results of research into unidentified flying objects and related phenomena. So that's still in the books. The problem that happened is that after all these efforts, the government of Grenada was overthrown in a coup. Now, I don't blame particularly the United States because it was overthrown by communists. And I don't think the United States would be supporting a communist takeover in the Caribbean. It would be not the usual thing to do. They did support many coups in Latin America, of course, over the years, but they were always right-wing military coups. Gary was actually right-wing politically, but he was eccentric when it came to the subject of UFOs. He was spending a lot of time in New York with all this lobbying, and he had a political rival, opponent, called Bishop, Maurice Bishop, and so he was overthrown. Then they smeared his character in the press. They said that Gary was crazy, basically, was a believer in voodoo and flying saucers. And this was taken by all the New York press, and I suppose the world press, but I remember the New York press. It was plastered all over the place. And that basically was the end of the UN initiative by Grenada. Then eventually, Bishop himself was overthrown by an even harder core communist regime and killed. Gary was not killed. It was, he wasn't even in Grenada when the coup took place. So he lived in San Diego, I believe, for many years. And Bishop, after the overthrow of Bishop, is when the United States sent the Marines, when Ronald Reagan sent the Marines. That was in 1983. They overthrew that regime. Gary was eventually allowed to come back, but as a private citizen. And that was the end of the UFO initiative. Now, the problem is that in order to get something going at the UN, it has to be done by a member nation. This was explained many times, for instance, by Coleman and Kavinsky, who used to send letters and memorandums to the Secretary Generals and to the various officials, lobbying for a UN involvement in the issue. And basically the answer was always the same. Even if the Secretary General is favorable, predisposed, likes the issue, believes in it, whatever, he cannot do anything. He doesn't have the way the UN is structured. He's only an administrator. It's the member nations that decide what is to take place. So unless we get a member nation to bring the issue again and to basically take it over from where it was left from that decision, then nothing will happen. In 1998, we had the hope that this would be the case. What you see in the slide is the República de San Marino, the oldest still existing republic in the world. It's one of these little city-states that there are many in Europe, like Monaco and Liechtenstein. Those are monarchies. San Marino is a republic. It's in central Italy, and it's, as far as culturally speaking, is Italian. They speak Italian and all that, but it's an independent country. In 1992, they had become a full member of the United Nations. In the mid-90s, they began doing UFO conferences. I forgot exactly when. Paola Harris probably can tell us. And there was a Ministry of Tourism there, and who's a very important. Normally, the Ministry of Tourism wouldn't be that important in another country, but in San Marino, it's like the prime minister because that's the main source of income. So it's a very important political position, and he was very, very pro-UFO. They had the San Marino UFO Symposium is officially sponsored by the Ministry of Tourism as a way to bring attention to the country and to bring visitors and all that. I mean, it has that obvious reason. But there was a hope to bring this subject of the UN, that San Marino could take over where Grenada left it. And that was the reason I got involved in this too. The first time I was invited to San Marino by Roberto Pinotti, who is the main coordinator of all the programs, was to lecture about the history of UFOs at the UN. Well, here we see a picture, although that was, I believe, another year, but it's a great picture for me personally. You see Sun Shili from China, the late John Mack, myself, Monsignor Balducci, who lectured here 2 years ago, and Michael Hesseman. And in the year of '98, though, where Colonel Corso was was present, that's the one time I met him, we actually signed the document. All the attendees of that symposium, and this was presented to the government of San Marino, and we were hoping that San Marino then would take the ball from us and take it to the UN. But unfortunately, there were political things. There was a change of government. This was not a coup this time. It was just like a rotation, which San Marino has this rotational system of the political parties. And the next Minister of Tourism they still kept sponsoring the symposium, but they weren't willing to take the subject to the UN. So that was that. Well, so we're still waiting for a country. We need some country, probably preferably small. I mean, it would be great to have a big country, but the chances are that it's a small country that has less to lose, that would bring this up. So if you have any ideas, let me know. But now, so we'll leave the UN story at that, because basically it's in standstill. Unless we get a country that is willing to, and we have the decision from the Grenada days, so that we don't have to repeat those steps. It just has to be revive the decision where it was left. Now we're going to discuss briefly some of the UFO investigations that have taken place around the world, official investigations. Since any kind of study, you're going to have to show official evidence. It's always more convincing, or unless you have physical evidence. If you have physical evidence, that's even better. That speaks by itself. Now, and this is strange that this story got very little play in the United States. I learned it because of my many trips to San Marino, because after '98, I continued to go there many times. And it was known as the Mussolini UFO documents. But like I said, it got very, very little play in the United States, and it was a fascinating story. And the story basically was that in the 1930s, there was a number of sightings in Italy. And this precedes any other investigation. Even the Foo Fighters of World War II, that you have to wait for World War II. There were, of course, sightings in the past. You have the airship flap in the 1890s in America and so on, but there was no official involvement, just press. But in the 1930s, it so appears that there were a number of sightings that took place over Italy that concerned the fascist government quite a bit, because initially they probably thought that these were possibly secret weapons, advanced airplanes from other countries, from France or from England or whatever. So the Mussolini government took them seriously. Of course, they don't call them UFOs or flying saucers. Those terms would be used later. They used a variety of names. One is unconventional air vehicles. It's just kind of a pretty objective definition when you think about it. And now, let me tell you briefly how these documents came about. There's some similarity to the Majestic 12 type documents in the sense that were not officially declassified by the Italian government, but they were mailed anonymously to researchers in Italy. But there was a key difference to the Majestic 12. These were not copies. The Majestic 12, if you remember, were always photographs of documents, which means you cannot conduct forensic analysis of the document itself. You can analyze the contents or whatever, but you cannot do a chemical analysis of the paper, the ink, and so on. The difference with these documents is that these were the original copies. So, and these were sent to the CUN, the Centro Ufologico Nazionale, National UFO Center, which is run by Pinotti, who is the coordinator for the San Marino symposiums. He also learned the lessons from some of the mess that has happened with the American documents, and he kept it very quiet until the investigation was completed. No premature announcement and things like that. He then contacted a forensic analyst who was attached to the Italian Ministry of Justice, an expert in paper, ink, all these things. And a thorough study was conducted of the documents. This man was not at all interested in UFOs, had no beef in the matter, was neither believed nor disbelieved. That was not his field. He was strictly hired to do a forensic analysis of the documents, look at the paper, look at the ink, and also look at the contents, if the lexicon conformed to the type of language of the Italian fascist bureaucracy of the 1930s. Well, to make the story short, basically the final verdict was that the documents were real. The paper, the ink, was all from the 1930s. The contents were the type of language that had been used at the time, and so on. Well, here you see one of many of these documents. There are not that many altogether. There are probably about, I forgot the exact number, about 30 or something like that, individual pieces of paper. And this is a sighting report. You can see the drawing in the bottom. It was also said in these papers that the Mussolini government, which was very concerned about these documents, had created a secret department to deal with this subject, which is called, it's similar again to Majestic 12, but preceding it by 15 years, called Cabinet RS/33. And the head of this department was none other than Professor Marconi, one of the most famous scientists of the period, and certainly the most famous Italian scientist, inventor of the wireless telegraph and so on. And many other Italian leading scientists were part of this, all of them, of course, deceased now. Well, Italy was a dictatorship at the time, so there was no problem to control the press. They already had control over the press. And, but they still wanted to make sure that if these objects were seen, and we're not talking of crash UFOs, but just sightings, the public had to, you know, this information had to be given to the public so that the public wouldn't start thinking about things. So they would, you know, come up with, well, meteor showers or whatever. So they had all this in place, both the collection of the evidence and the disinformation campaign. So this precedes, as far as I'm concerned, this would definitely be the first official UFO investigation anywhere in the world. And many of you have probably heard about the Nazi flying saucers and things that the Nazis did. Well, Italy was allied with the Nazis. So obviously all this information was later fed into the Germans. And that might explain why the Germans were experimenting with disc-shaped objects and things like that. One of the engineers, in fact, that working on these disc-shaped objects was Italian. Belonzo was his name. Okay, move quickly now to other areas. In 1979, the House of Lords of in England had a famous UFO debate. It was a classic. It lasted like 4 hours. And it became so popular that even was published as a book edited by John Michel, which is what you see here. Again, the reason that this even took place is because one of the members of the House of Lords, Lord Clancarty, happened to be an ufologist. You know, the British always have these eccentric aristocrats that do all kinds of weird things, and it's happened forever. And so it's not surprising that you had an ufologist at the House of Lords. And for any other country, for the United States, it would be extremely surprising to have something like a senator, you know, ufologist. That wouldn't happen here. But in England, that's possible. And they even had a UFO study group and everything. Clancarty had written a number of books, not under the Lord thing, but Lepore Trench, John Lepore Trench. So he's the one, again, being a member, he could bring the subject, and they had a big debate, and some of the lords were skeptical, and some were in favor, and it was with great language and bombastics and everything. Of course, the House of Lords, even though it's the upper chamber, but because it's an anachronism, comes from the old days of England, you know, when they really did have a lot of power, but it's not elected democratically. That's the House, so really it's the House of Commons, the one that deals with, that has much more power. The House of Lords is mostly symbolical. The Ministry of Defense, and we have, of course, in this conference, I don't know if he's here in the room, Nick Pope, whom I met many times, and he, of course, worked at the Ministry of Defense at the UFO desk many years ago, and then he worked in other departments. Over the years, the British have released some documents, not as many as the Americans, though. The Americans, even and nothing else, they have released more documents than the British. And the British also have a pretty stern, you know, the Official Secrets Acts. You cannot sue them for additional documents or nothing. Whatever they give you, that's it. You're lucky to get it. But still, over the years, after 25 years is when they released some documents. And recently, this was all over the internet too, they had released a number of documents of sightings in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, which is what you see here in this map. Well, as you know, I was one of the co-authors of the UFO briefing document, The Best Available Evidence, which was initially a document that was sent to members of Congress. It was a lobbying document initially. Later, it became a popular book. It was in the year 2000. And in this document, we did discuss all these various official investigations. well, not all. We had to be very selective. We couldn't do if you do it with too thick a document, then no congressman would read it. So it had to be pretty short. Well, not that short, but, you know, just the right size. And one of the cases we had was the fantastic incident that took place in the Canary Islands in Spain. And so this is another country that's had a number of investigations over the years. In the case of Spain, they're run by the Spanish Air Force. But they appoint like a judge advocate man in charge. And then he is in charge of that investigation. And in some cases, they can be quite thorough. They were finally declassified partially beginning in the 90s because the Spanish government did not have like a Freedom of Information Act type law. So they had to pass actually a special law. But what was interesting is they passed the law in 92 for the declassification only of the UFO documents because they didn't want to declassify, you know, probably human rights abuses that had taken place under Franco or whatever. So they restricted it to UFOs. Well, that's what we wanted anyway, so it worked for us. And so this was an incident that was seen all over the islands, and this is one photograph that was taken. It consists basically of two parts. The one part would be the sighting report, and this now is part of the official dossier of documents. And what you see here, this is what was seen by a Navy destroyer of the Spanish Navy called Atrevida. And so this is based on the Navy crew witnesses. And so you see this object that goes from one of the islands, and then this big halo expands. And when the halo reaches its maximum expansion is what you see in the photograph that I just showed. However, in the town of Guia, in the Gran Canary Island, there was a doctor called Dr. Padron who had been asked, had received a patient call. And he was just arriving on a taxi to visit the patient when he saw hovering right above the house of the patient this transparent sphere with two very tall beings. And this is an artist's rendition of what the witnesses saw, both the doctor and the taxi driver. And the patient also got a glimpse because as he came to greet the doctor, you know, she happened to see this briefly. Then this object flew away. And again, on the official documents, we do see the description of what these people saw. And it's the one thing which you see very rarely in official documents anywhere in the world, whether it's Spain, the United States, England, France, whatever, is cases involving humanoids or beings. They don't mind so much about lights or even objects being chased by airplanes. A lot of the official documents usually have to do with airplanes, with radar, things like that. But when it comes to humanoids with beings, it gets a little touchy there. So there are only very few documents anywhere in the world, and this is one of them. That's the reason we selected it. Well, we move briefly to France, and of course, most of you probably heard Gilles Dabourdet's lecture on the, I guess it was on the French UFO files. I wanted to see it myself, but we had to do a radio program with Jaime Maussan for the Spanish lectures that we're giving tomorrow, so unfortunately, we missed it. France, of course, has a very old and active history on UFOs. And it begins, well, there's probably a few isolated cases earlier, but it begins in earnest with the 1954 wave. At that time, the popular press used to call them the Martians, because that's what people were into. And this is one of the earlier French books dealing with that wave. And there were some military investigations going all the way back to the 50s. In the 70s, the French, being a very rational people as they are, they came up with a logical system to deal with UFOs. And that is to give instructions to the gendarmerie, the national gendarmerie, which is a sort of a national, like a state police, as opposed to the local police. And so this would be like state troopers But because France is not a federal system, then it's a national body. And they gave them instructions beginning in 1974. They had gotten involved previously in some cases, but they didn't have like a precise guidelines. 1974, they get guidelines how to deal with this phenomenon. So if you're a citizen in France and you see a UFO, you call the gendarmes. And they're not going to laugh at you because they have guidelines. And they're supposed to come and take your report. And then, and this is a photograph taken by one gendarme, as I understand. Now, then in 1977, the French National Space Agency, the equivalent of NASA, thanks to the efforts of an engineer there called Claude Poher, convinced the French government to create a small unit within the French Space Agency that could analyze UFO reports. And so, since they already had the system by the gendarmes, basically the gendarmes would send their files to the JEPAN, as this unit was called, and especially the best cases. And especially if there was a really good case, they would notify them the JEPAN, because the gendarme didn't have the time to do an in-depth investigation. I mean, they got other things to do, you know, like catching criminals and keeping the borders and so on. So if there was a real good case, they would tell the French Space Agency, then they would do the follow-up. Well, as you probably, most of you must have heard, in March of this year, to celebrate their 30th anniversary of this agency, the French decided to do a big disclosure, and they put their files online. Yeah, isn't that great? They put about 25% of the files now, but eventually the idea is to put all of them. This caused quite a stir, because a lot of people knew this was going to happen, that their website crashed. It was just too many people trying to get in there. Even when I tried to get in there, I was having trouble too, but eventually they fixed it, and it's fine. The problem is that their files are in French, so if you don't know French, good luck. Bon chance. And they don't have many pictures, so if you're looking for nice videos, it's not a commercial site, you know, and they're not selling anything, and it's basically the facts, you know. They do have some statistics, and the statistics are interesting, especially the last one that we will show. This is statistic by region. So this is the number of reports depending on the region. The big one there is Île-de-France, which would be the middle of France where Paris is, Provence, the Rhone Alps. You know, those are some of the bigger ones. Small little one, there would be Corsica, small island, so on. So that gives you an idea of the number of reports that they get by region. Then the next one is the number of reports by year. So this is a good system to let you know which years they had a peak, which years was a flap. Clearly there you see 1993, long, big spike. 1996, another spike, and so on. So that is the distribution by year. Now this one is the distribution by classification of observations. And they basically divide their phenomenon in 4 categories. A, which is the blue one, was phenomenon, perfectly identified phenomena. So that would be, you know, the 9%. This is the ones that clearly was a rocket launch or an advertisement plane or whatever, Aurora Borealis, whatever it was. Only 9%. Then B, which is the dark red, phenomena which is probably identified. So they think it might be an airplane or something, but they're not sure. Then C, which is the white one, it would be unidentified phenomenon, but lack of information. And this is 30%. This would be the Project Blue Book. This was their favorite one, you know, not enough data. So they could lump a lot of stuff in there. But the French only put 30% in there. And then D, finally, which is the one which we will be interested, is unidentified phenomena, and that's 28%. Now, that is a much higher percentage than the civilian UFO organizations in America. If you consult CUFOS or MUFON, they'll tell you only 10%, more or less. Sometimes 5% are truly unidentified. Here you have an official government agency attached to the space agency that is telling you almost 30% is unexplained. They couldn't identify it, which is actually a very similar figure to what the Condon report came. Condon report, you have heard, right, for the University of Colorado. The introduction of the Condon report and the way the story was manipulated was that, oh, it debunked UFOs. But if you looked at the actual case studies, one by one, 25% or something were unidentified. All right. Another thing the French did, and this was early on in their investigation, was they came up with a methodological model to how to investigate UFOs, and this is known as the tetrahedral model. This was devised by the second director of the Japan, an engineer called Alain Sterle. And so you see a tetrahedron. In the center, where it says stimulus, that is, in this case, would be the UFO. And then you have 4 vertices, 4 areas where you can investigate this phenomenon. Down there, you see témoin, witness, the physical environment, especially if it's a landing case or whatever, the witness report, and what they call the psychosocial environment. This is a sort of a sociological aspect, you know. Did this happen during a flap where there was a lot of media attention, that sort of thing? Was the witness heavily believed in UFOs or not? This has been used by some skeptics in Europe, which is known as the psychosocial school, where they kind of take over that aspect, and they sort of explain everything from a psychosocial or sociological aspect. But this is not what this model is saying. This model is saying that that's only one parameter, and it's a parameter that should be looked at, but only one. Okay, now by far the most important probably case of the UFO files is the Trans-en-Provence landing case, which took place in 1981. Many of you might have heard of this. And right now, but only if you know French, you can go to the Japan website and download the whole report, but it's in French. Otherwise, you can consult our book, the UFO briefing document, where we have a summary of the case in English. This was a landing case of a disc-shaped object, as you see on the bottom, that landed on the property of an Italian farmer, but that lived in Provence, in the south of France, called Renato Nicolai. And you can see from the arrows how the UFO came down, landed, then took off that direction, and then went away. Was there only a few minutes. The day was clear, was a daytime sighting, and Nicolai, this thing seemed so metallic and so real that initially he thought, oh, it must be some government device or something. He contacted the gendarmerie. The gendarmerie came within 24 hours. So one of the great things about this case is that the physical evidence was collected right away. Because if you go and study a landing site 2 weeks later, which sometimes happens to civilian groups, we don't even hear about it till 3 weeks later, then already the site is contaminated. But here, the samples were collected right away, and they were all investigated officially. There were no civilian ufologists here. There was only the government and scientists from universities and so on. Here's the landing traces of the case. We were lucky because one of the coordinators of our report, the briefing document, Marie Goldbrith, her husband had been ambassador of the United States in France. So she had been the ambassador's wife in Paris. She knew everybody, Chirac, everybody. So we got all the reports directly from the space agency. We got the original reports, and including the photograph, which is rarely seen. The case is mentioned in many cases, but you never get to see the photograph of the landing. And here you finally see the final conclusions, summary and conclusions of the Trans-en-Provence. You can read it yourself. The witness, no particular expectations. In other words, he didn't want to make money, or he wasn't a big UFO believer. He was just a farmer, practical guy. Account, precise, coherent. Psychological environment, no special influence. Again, he was not in drugs or anything. Physical environment, there was impact when the thing landed, friction, iron, zinc deposit, temperature up to 600 degrees centigrade. And then this is the most important, biological effects noted. Premature aging of young alfalfa plants. In other words, and I had met Huneeus, who's one of the scientists. What he said is physiologically, the plants, these were alfalfa plants, were young. But after the incident, they became biochemically old. And he said there's nothing in nature that can produce this effect. Then other effects, photosynthesis modified, the chlorophyll of the plants is gone. And what they call it time-space effect, then again, this would be that aging. Conclusion, and I remind to you, these are official conclusions. Physical phenomenon of unexplained nature, high probability of electromagnetic mode of propulsion. So we're not talking of a natural phenomena, we're talking of some kind of technology which is unexplained. This is what makes this case so interesting. You do have the physical evidence, and you do have official conclusions. And then also, Trans-en-Provence was not by itself. It appeared in this chart together with 3 other landing cases, Christelle in '79, Amarant in 1982, and one that was nicknamed Joe Le Taxi in 1984. Amarant was particularly interesting. It had very similar effects to Trans-en-Provence, but the witness was a PhD in biochemistry, was an extremely well-educated man, and the Japan investigators were really impressed with his testimony. Okay, let's keep moving. Belgium, I'm not going to go into it, but we've all heard about the famous Belgian wave. I myself was in Belgium, although by the time I got there, it was after the wave. But I did visit the SOBEPS, which is the main Belgium group, and I saw all their files and all that. As you know, this was characterized by the triangle, by the famous triangle that was seen all over Belgium, and at least one beautiful photograph was taken, known as the Petit Rechin photo. The original, this was taken on a slide, and the original slide was analyzed thoroughly, even at the Royal Military Academy, and no sign of trickery was found. And on top, you see some of the computer enhancement. Eventually, the Belgian Air Force, which had not been involved particularly with UFO investigations, this thing was so big and massive, this wave over Belgium, that they had to get involved. But they cooperated with SOBEPS. SOBEPS was a civilian organization, but very well organized, and they had good scientists. So the military had actually got involved with the civilians to help them, because the civilians were professors of physics and things like that, and they were more familiar with the UFO subject. But eventually, by '92 or something, the wave. At one point, we also thought Belgium might be the great country to bring this thing to the UN. But it didn't happen. And also Belgium is too involved with the US because of NATO, and it's right at the center of the European community and all that. It would be difficult. There might have been a small window when the flap happened, but afterwards there would be no chance. Briefly, and I'm not going to go, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to try to race through some of the last cases. We also had the famous Iranian dogfight in our document, which is a very famous case. I'm not going to go into it. This is when happened in 1976, when it still was the time of the Shah, when F-4 Phantom jets were chased to chase a UFO, were scrambled. But what is significant here is the preface to this document, which was at one time a classified and a specialized magazine of the U.S. military, Air Force Electronic Warfare Center, called the MIGI Quarterly. And listen to this introduction. Sometime in his career, each pilot can expect to encounter strange, unusual happenings which will never be adequately or entirely explained by logic or subsequent investigation. Sometime in his career, each pilot is supposed to encounter a UFO. And this is an intelligence Air Force document. So much that, oh, the U.S. military don't believe in UFOs. Don't believe when you hear that. Well, since we're talking about pilots and UFOs, there you have it. It's a photograph. It was given to me in one of my trips to Chile, taken from an airplane window from an aircraft in Chile. In Chile, of course, we do have an official investigation, which got started in 1997, and it is run by the air traffic controllers, by the equivalent of the FAA. It's basically a small department. It's not a big deal in terms of size or budget, but it is official. It's run by Air Force General Bermudez, General Ricardo Bermudez, and it is part of the air traffic controllers department, for the whole civil aviation, which in Chile, as in many countries, Brazil, Mexico, many places, the civilian agency for aircraft, for airlines and stuff, is also part of the Air Force. It's a civilian agency, but under the umbrella of the Air Force. This is a photograph of some kind of military parade ceremony of the Chilean army, and there you see also an object. It was leaked by one of the military people there, member, and given to one of my friends, ufologists in Santiago. And then in the year 2000, we had a symposium, which was extraordinary, and it seemed like the beginning for something big, but unfortunately, like many of these things, it was the beginning, but it stayed in the beginning. It didn't prosper. This is called the International Air Expo, and it's a big aeronautical expo, one of the biggest in the world, where you want to buy Mirage jets or radar equipment, this sort of thing, you go there. And they have them all over in different parts of the world, so make them for different military attachés and all that. And it happens as a big airfield outside Santiago, and it's run by an Air Force general. He oversees this whole thing. And in fact, the early days of the thing is not even open to the public. That's when the military attachés and the government goes to buy and to look at the helicopters and all these kinds of weapons and devices. But in the year 2000, as part of this whole thing, and then towards the end of the thing, they open it to the public and they do air shows and lectures, and they usually have astronauts invited and so on. So in the year 2000, there was a UFO symposium, and that was officially sponsored by this event, which was at the opening of the event, you had a speech by the president of Chile and everything. And I was lucky to be there. And so was the man in charge at that time of this French space agency, Jean-Jacques Velasco. He was invited. Dick Haynes from the United States, who was a NASA engineer, and Benitez, J.J. Benitez, a famous Spanish author. We were the 4 speakers. It was quite an extraordinary thing. China, we had to at least mention it, since China is such an upcoming country in all respects. Mostly we hear about China have to do with economics, but and their emergence as a great power. But since the late 70s, China finally kind of joined the rest of the world too, and recognizing that there is such a thing as UFOs. Prior to that, had been a total blackout. The Chinese, unlike the Russians, who at least occasionally talked about it under the communist period, the Chinese had completely never mentioned it. But then they created an organization called the China UFO Research Organization, or CURO, which is a semi-official organization. It's not exactly a government agency, but it is attached to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and the University of Wuhan. And it had many scientists and engineers. And the president is a friend of mine, Professor Sun-Shi Lee, who's quite a prominent guy in China. Among other things, he speaks perfectly Spanish. And this is one reason why I become friends. I've even had the occasion to have to interpret for him at conferences, because he speaks Spanish but no English. So sometimes I had to interpret for him. And he was the Spanish interpreter for Chairman Mao. So that's part of his background. He's a professor of economics at Beijing University. So this is not your run-of-the-mill ufologist. And in fact, he's the only ufologist who's appeared both on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. No one else has had this honor or whatever you want to call it. He did. So Sun-Chi Lee is a great guy, and he is involved in the China UFO aspect. In fact, on top there, you can see, I believe that is part of the article from the New York Times. UFO boom doesn't worry officials. Chinese seem pretty open-minded about it. But I think they prefer this way. That way they don't have to have an official agency. They have a semi-official agency, and that seems to work for them. And then the Russians, and I'm sure I'm running out of time, the Russians also have had a long involvement since the days of communism, but in the days of communism it was quite tightly controlled. But there were periods where there were bursts and it would be some disclosure. This is from an official Army magazine, rather Air Force magazine called Aviation and Cosmonautics. And in the 1990s, and when you had the glasnost period, you know, where the press opened up for the first time, this magazine was running a series on UFO cases. In the briefing document, we also had a very important case from what was still the Soviet Union at a Russian missile base in Siberia, a place called Kapustin Yar, in July 1989, when a UFO, as you can see on the diagram, the upper part is actually the eyewitness drawing, and then the lower part is a recreation of the object. There's very similar to the Ben Waters case or the Rendlesham case in England, where that effect was also encountered, where the UFO was shooting a thin beam into the weapons storage area. And there was nothing like the military could do to prevent it. And also in Russia, you had the triangular cases, very similar to Belgium. This was known as the Samara Triangle. In the lower Volga region. There was a whole flap. I was friends with Dr. Vladimir Avinsky, who came in several times to the United States, and he gave me much material, including this wave. And I think that's about it as far as the slides go. This is from an old footage. Again, a triangular object. This is a frame from a 16mm film that was kept secret for many, many years. And it was taken, well, now that's an independent country, Latvia, but at that time it was the Soviet Union in Riga, at the Riga airport, the capital of Latvia. So I guess I'm out of time. So thank you very much. And keep looking for the oddball country that would take the UFO issue to the United Nations.